I never liked camping. I only went because my friend, Ben, wouldn't shut up about it. "It'll be fun," he said. "Get away from everything for a weekend." He always had that enthusiasm for things that required too much effort. I, on the other hand, liked the safety of my home, my locked doors, and my familiar surroundings. But somehow he convinced me, and that was the biggest mistake of my life. We chose a spot deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from town. Ben had been there before, said it was quiet, away from people, perfect for a real camping experience. I didn't care about that. I just wanted the weekend to pass without any trouble. We packed up the truck and left early Saturday morning. The road leading to the campsite was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel. Trees lined both sides, thick and endless. It felt like we were driving into the middle of nowhere, which, in hindsight, we were. The place was empty when we arrived. No other tents, no signs of people, just trees, dirt, and silence. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The ground was uneven, and the air felt thick, like a storm was coming. I ignored it. We set up the tent, gathered firewood, and cooked over an open flame. It felt normal for a while, even peaceful. But then, something felt off. It started with the sounds, or rather, the lack of them. The usual noises you hear in the woods: chirping insects, rustling leaves, distant animal calls. All faded as the sun set. It was like someone had pressed a mute button on nature. Even the wind stopped. I told myself it was nothing, but my body disagreed. My skin prickled, my stomach twisted. I felt like something was watching us, something just beyond the tree line. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made my heart pound. The crack of a branch, the shuffle of leaves. I told myself it was just animals. But the footsteps, those weren't animals. I wasn't sure if I imagined it or not, but I swore I heard slow, deliberate footsteps circling our tent. Not running, not stumbling, walking, like whoever or whatever it was wanted us to know it was there. I held my breath, listening. Ben was out cold, snoring. I thought about waking him, but what would I even say? "Hey, I think there's someone out there, but I'm too scared to check?" He'd laugh, call me paranoid, so I stayed quiet. Eventually, the footsteps faded. I convinced myself I had imagined it. Maybe I was just on edge. The woods were unfamiliar. My brain was playing tricks on me. But the next morning, I saw the footprints. They weren't ours. They were fresh, deep, leading around the tent in a perfect circle. My stomach dropped. Someone had been out there, watching us. I shook Ben awake, pointed at the prints. He frowned but didn't seem as freaked out as I was. "Could be a hiker," he said, "or an animal." I wanted to believe that, but the prints were human, barefoot. The toes dug into the dirt like whoever made them had been moving slowly, carefully. I told Ben we should leave. He laughed it off, said we were fine. "We came out here to get away, remember?" he said. "You're just not used to it." I wanted to argue, but I didn't. Instead, I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little noise. The feeling of being watched never left. That night, it got worse. I woke up to the sound of breathing. Not Ben's, something else. It was deep, slow, coming from outside the tent. My chest tightened. I could hear it shifting, moving. Then, the zipper. It started to lower. I froze. My mind screamed at me to move, to do something. But I couldn't. I just stared as the zipper moved inch by inch, something or someone on the other side. Then silence. Nothing moved. The zipper stopped halfway. I held my breath, waiting. The seconds stretched into eternity. Then, suddenly, a sharp, guttural noise. Like a growl, but not an animal's. It came from just beyond the thin fabric of the tent. I lunged for my flashlight, flicked it on. The light hit the zipper. Nothing there. No movement. No shadows. But the prints, they were back. I grabbed Ben, shaking him awake. This time, he didn't laugh. He saw the fear in my face, heard the tremble in my voice. We packed up in record time. No words, no discussion. We just grabbed our stuff and ran for the truck. As we drove away, I looked back, just for a second, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees. Tall, thin, barely visible in the darkness. Watching. I never went camping again. I used to love camping alone. Something about the silence, the way the air smells like pine and damp earth, the feeling of being completely cut off from the noise of everyday life. It always gave me a sense of peace. I never thought that would change, but it did. It changed one October when I went into the woods and saw something I shouldn't have. I had planned the trip for weeks. The spot I chose was about 15 miles off a back road, deep in the national forest. No campgrounds, no designated trails, just raw wilderness. I parked my truck near a clearing, packed my gear, and hiked a few miles in, following an old logging road that had been reclaimed by nature. I didn't see a single person on the way in, which was exactly how I wanted it. By the time I reached a good spot to set up camp, the sun was hanging low in the sky. I picked a small clearing next to a creek. The water was clear and fast-moving, perfect for drinking after filtering it. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. The air was crisp but not too cold. It was perfect. That first night was uneventful. I ate some canned soup, sat by the fire for a while, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the distant hoots of an owl and the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. It was peaceful, but the next day things started to feel off. I woke up early, made some instant coffee, and decided to do a bit of exploring. I had my map and compass, but mostly I just wanted to wander. The forest was dense, but not difficult to navigate. I walked for about an hour, following the creek upstream. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, near the bank of the creek, something was hanging from a tree. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe caught in some kind of snare. But as I got closer, I realized it was a bundle of sticks, tied together with what looked like old rope. The sticks were arranged in a weird, almost human shape. Something about it made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was nothing, just some hunter messing around, maybe kids playing a prank. But it didn't sit right with me. The rope looked old, like it had been there for a long time, but the sticks were fresh. Someone had made this recently. I turned around and headed back to camp, shaking off the unease. But as the day went on, that feeling didn't go away. I kept catching myself looking over my shoulder. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made my skin crawl. I wasn't scared exactly, but I wasn't comfortable either. That night, I made my fire a little bigger than usual. I sat close to it, listening. The forest around me felt different, too quiet. Even the usual sounds of the night, crickets, distant owls, were absent. The only noise was the crackling of my fire and the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something. A branch snapping, leaves crunching, footsteps, always just outside the light of the fire. I told myself it was animals, deer maybe, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning I made a decision. I wasn't going to spend another night out there. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, constantly glancing around. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, just beyond my sight. I started hiking back toward my truck, moving fast, too fast. About 2 miles in, I twisted my ankle on a hidden root. Pain shot up my leg, and I stumbled to the ground, cursing. I tried to stand, but putting weight on it was agony. I was still miles from my truck. I forced myself to keep moving, slower now, using a stick for support. Every step was a sharp burst of pain, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of those woods. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones in the soft dirt of the trail. They weren't mine. They were bigger, barefoot, and they were following the exact same path I had taken the day before. Someone had been tracking me. My stomach dropped. My hands started shaking. I wasn't alone out here. Someone had been watching me since yesterday, maybe longer. I didn't run, I couldn't, but I moved as fast as my ankle would allow. Every shadow felt like it was hiding something. Every noise made my heart hammer. I was sure that at any moment, I'd hear footsteps rushing up behind me. But I didn't. I made it back to my truck, gasping for breath, my clothes soaked in sweat. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. But there was nothing, just trees and shadows. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away. I didn't relax until I was back on the main road, surrounded by other cars, civilization, safety. I never went back to that forest. I still go camping, but never alone, and never that deep into the woods, because I don't know who or what was out there with me, and I don't ever want to find out. I don't know if I'll ever go camping again. I used to love it, the peace, the solitude, the feeling of being out in the wild with nothing but the sounds of nature around me. It always felt like an escape from the routine of life. But after what happened last summer, I don't think I'll ever set foot in the woods again. I had planned a solo trip to a remote spot in the mountains. I wanted to challenge myself to disconnect from the world for a few days. I picked a location I had read about online, deep in the forest, miles away from any marked trails. It was supposed to be a place where few people ever went. That was part of the appeal. The drive to the trailhead was long and bumpy, the kind of road where you don't see another car for miles. By the time I parked and got my gear out, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. I set off quickly, following an old, overgrown trail that led deeper into the woods. The hike was tough, steep in places with loose rocks and thick undergrowth. I hadn't seen any signs of people the whole way in, which reassured me that I would have the place to myself. It took me a couple of hours to reach the spot I had chosen, a small clearing next to a creek. The water was crystal clear, the air was cool, and the forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some wood for a fire, and cooked a quick meal before settling in for the night. That first night was peaceful. The only sounds were the occasional rustling in the underbrush and the distant hoot of an owl. I slept better than I had in months. The second day I spent exploring the area. I hiked up a nearby ridge to get a better view of the valley below. It was stunning, endless green stretching out in every direction. As I made my way back down, I noticed something strange. About half a mile from my campsite, there was a small pile of stones stacked neatly in a clearing. It wasn't natural. Someone had placed them there, put me on edge. I hadn't seen any signs of other campers. No footprints, no old fire pits, nothing. But someone had been here recently. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just an old marker left behind by another hiker. That night, as I was sitting by the fire, I started to feel uneasy. The woods felt different, quieter. The normal sounds of the forest seemed muted. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard something. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees behind me. I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, but these weren't the sounds of a four-legged creature. They were human. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the sound. Nothing, just trees and darkness. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, that the forest was playing tricks on me. But I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise made me jolt awake. I kept my knife close, just in case. The next morning, I found something that made my blood run cold. Around my campsite, in the dirt, were footprints. They weren't mine. Someone had been circling my tent while I slept. I packed up immediately. I told myself I was overreacting, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out. I should have listened. I started the hike back toward my car, moving as quickly as I could without exhausting myself. The entire time I felt watched. Every so often I would stop and listen. I heard nothing, but the feeling wouldn't go away. About an hour into the hike, I came across something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A fresh pile of stones, identical to the one I had seen the day before. And next to it, stuck into the ground, was a stick with something tied to it. Piece of fabric. My fabric. It was a torn strip from the shirt I had been wearing the day before. I didn't think. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life. My pack bounced against my back. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I don't know how long I ran before I finally reached my car. I threw my pack in, started the engine, and sped out of there, not daring to slow down until I was miles away. I never reported it. What would I have said? That someone had been watching me? Stalking me? Leaving signs in the woods? There was no proof. No crime had been committed. But I know what I felt. I know what I saw. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. I haven't gone camping since, and I don't think I ever will again. I always thought of myself as someone who could handle being alone in the woods. I grew up camping, hiking, and spending time in nature without ever feeling afraid. I liked the quiet, the space to think, and the way the trees made me feel small in a way that was comforting. But last summer, I learned that the woods are different when you're truly alone, and that fear isn't something you choose. It's something that finds you. I had planned a solo camping trip deep in the mountains of northern Montana, a place I had visited a couple of times before with friends. This time, I wanted to challenge myself to go further in, beyond where most people would hike, and spend a few days in complete isolation. I packed my gear carefully. A tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 5 days, a satellite phone in case of emergency, a knife, and a rifle for any potential wildlife encounters. I knew the risks. Bears, cougars, maybe a bad fall, but I felt prepared. I had done this before, just never alone. The first day was perfect. I hiked about 10 miles from where I parked my truck, following a narrow, overgrown trail that eventually disappeared entirely. That's what I wanted. No signs of people, no reminders of civilization. Just me, the trees, and the sounds of the forest. I set up camp near a small stream, cooked some dehydrated food over my portable stove, and watched the sun go down through the branches. The second day was uneventful, but by the third night, something changed. It started with a sound. I was lying in my tent, half asleep, when I heard what I thought was the snap of a branch. I opened my eyes, fully awake now, and listened. The woods are full of noises at night. Wind through the trees, small animals moving through the underbrush. But this was different. It had a weight to it, like something big was moving out there. I told myself it was an elk or a deer, maybe even a bear. But when I reached for my rifle, just to be safe, I realized my hand was shaking. I stayed still, listening. The sound came again, another snap, closer this time. Then silence. No wind, no insects, nothing. Just a dead, heavy stillness. I don't know how long I lay there, gripping my rifle, barely breathing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the early morning light filtering through the tent. Everything seemed normal again. I forced myself to laugh at how paranoid I had been. The woods had played tricks on me, that was all. I decided to stay one more night. That was a mistake. That evening, as the sun was setting, I went to gather some more firewood. I walked about 50 yards from camp, picking up dry branches, when I noticed something odd. The forest floor, which had been covered in leaves and pine needles, looked disturbed, like something had been dragged through it. I followed the marks, my pulse quickening. They led to a tree. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, but then I noticed deep, jagged scratches in the bark, far too large to be from any animal I knew. And there was something else. High up, almost at my eye level, was a long strip of fabric caught in the bark. It was faded, almost blending in with the tree, but when I touched it, I realized it was clothing. Old clothing, weathered and torn. My mind started racing. Was it from a lost hiker? An old campsite? Or was it something worse? I backed away, suddenly feeling exposed. The sun was almost gone, and the forest around me felt darker than it should have been. I hurried back to camp, throwing the wood down next to the fire pit. I wanted to leave, but hiking out in the dark wasn't an option. That night, I barely slept. Every noise made my heart pound. Every rustle in the leaves sent adrenaline coursing through me. Then, At some point in the night, I heard something that made my blood go cold. It was breathing, not the soft exhale of a deer or the snuffling of a bear. It was slow, deliberate, human. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just gripped my rifle and listened. The sound was right outside my tent, barely feet away. I could hear it shifting, as if it was crouched close to the ground. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. Nothing. Eventually, I worked up the courage to reach for my flashlight. My fingers fumbled with the switch, and when the beam finally cut through the darkness, there was nothing there. But my gear had been moved. My backpack, which I had left zipped and tucked under the rain flap of my tent, was now half open, sitting 2 feet away. Some of my food was missing. My knife, which had been inside the backpack, was now lying in the dirt. Something had been in my camp. I didn't wait until morning. I packed up as fast as I could, heart hammering in my chest. The hike back to my truck was the longest hike of my life. Every step I felt watched. Every shadow between the trees felt like it was hiding something. I didn't stop to eat, to rest, to think. I just walked, pushing myself forward. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back. I don't know what was out there. Person, predator, something worse. All I know is that I'll never camp alone again. I never should have gone camping alone. I knew it the second I heard that first noise in the woods. I had planned this trip for months. Work had been killing me, and I needed a break from everything. The emails, the meetings, the constant noise. I figured a weekend in the mountains would help. Just me, my tent, and the quiet. I chose a spot deep in the woods, far from the usual campsites, somewhere no one would bother me. That was the whole point. The first day went fine. I hiked a few miles, set up camp by a small stream, and gathered enough firewood to last the night. Felt good being out there alone, away from people. As the sun went down, the air cooled fast, and the sounds of the forest changed. The rustling leaves, the distant calls of birds. It was peaceful. I cooked a quick meal over the fire, sat back against a log, and just listened to the night. Then I heard it. First, it was just a snap, a single branch breaking somewhere behind my tent. I figured it was an animal, probably a deer. But then, a few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. Another snap, followed by the crunch of leaves. Something was moving out there, circling my campsite. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the endless stretch of woods. The fire crackled beside me, the only sound breaking the silence. I told myself it was nothing, maybe the wind, maybe a raccoon, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I forced myself to ignore it. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped it shut. Lying there, I listened. Every small noise made my heart race. After what felt like hours, exhaustion won. I drifted off to sleep. A noise woke me up. Something outside. Heavy footsteps. Not the light scurrying of an animal, something bigger. Slow, deliberate. My body went rigid. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing. Low, steady breathing. I reached for my knife. My fingers wrapped around the handle, but I didn't move. I just lay there, waiting, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, the sound was gone. No footsteps, no breathing, just silence. I barely slept the rest of the night. Morning came and I forced myself out of the tent. The first thing I noticed were the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. Big, deep prints in the dirt, circling my campsite. My stomach turned. I wasn't alone out here. I packed up fast. I didn't want to spend another night in that spot. I'd hike back toward the main trail, find somewhere else to camp. As I walked, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. Every rustle, every shadow felt wrong. I was being watched. I knew it. By midday, I reached a clearing. I stopped to rest, but something caught my eye. Another set of footprints, fresh ones, leading into the trees. And then I saw something worse. A piece of fabric, hanging from a low branch. It was from my tent, torn, dangling like a warning. My stomach clenched. Someone had been in my camp while I slept. Someone had taken this and left it here on purpose. I needed to get out. Now, I pushed forward, moving fast. I wasn't thinking about where I was going, just that I needed to be somewhere safer, somewhere with other people. My legs ached, my lungs burned, but I kept going. Then I saw it, a cabin, small, run down, half hidden in the trees. I didn't care who it belonged to. I needed help. I ran up to the door and knocked. No answer. I knocked again, harder. Silence. I tried the handle, it was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was dusty, abandoned looking. A single chair, a table, an old wood stove. But something felt off. It smelled wrong, like old sweat and something rotting. Then I saw the pictures. Pinned to the wall, a collection of photos. My campsite, my tent, me, all taken from a distance. My blood turned to ice. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Whoever had been watching me, following me, they had been here. They knew I'd find this place. I turned to run, but I wasn't fast enough. The door slammed shut behind me. A heavy footstep creaked against the wooden floor. Someone was in here with me. I ran for the window, crashing through the glass, hitting the ground hard outside. Pain shot through my hands and knees, but I scrambled to my feet, running, tearing through the trees. I could hear footsteps behind me, gaining. Then a voice, not words, just a sound, low, guttural, like a growl. Close, too close. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. I don't remember how long I ran, only that when I finally stopped, I was back near the main trail. The sun had started to set, but I didn't stop moving until I saw another person. A hiker. I practically collapsed in front of him, gasping out something about needing help. By the time we reached a ranger station, I was shaking so hard I couldn't speak. They sent a team back to my campsite, to the cabin. They found my tent, my gear, but not the photos, and not the person who had been watching me. I never went camping alone again. I always thought camping alone was a peaceful escape. I liked the silence, the fresh air, the feeling of being out in the middle of nowhere where no one could bother me. That's why I took these trips every few months, to get away from everything. But this time, something was different. Something was wrong. I had picked a spot deep in the woods, about 10 miles off the nearest road. It was a place I had camped before, far from any trails, perfect for solitude. I hiked in early, set up my tent, and started a fire before sunset. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your skin but makes the fire feel even better. I sat there for a while, eating, listening to the distant sounds of the woods, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig, normal sounds. Then, as night settled in, I noticed something strange. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. It wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind that felt wrong, like something was off. Usually I could hear crickets, maybe an owl, but now there was nothing, just silence. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just my imagination. But I felt it. Something was watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it around the trees, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The fire crackled behind me, the only sound in the dead still night. I shook it off and went into my tent. I zipped up the entrance, got into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. I must have dozed off, but I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. Then I heard it, a sound outside, slow, deliberate footsteps. My body tensed up. I held my breath, listening. The steps weren't heavy like a bear's. They were softer, careful, human. I reached for my knife, gripping it tight in my hand. My mind raced. Who would be out here this deep in the woods? I knew there were no other campsites nearby. No one should have been anywhere near me. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady. I stayed completely still. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. I just listened. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps started again. They moved away, slow, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, knife in hand, waiting for the first light of morning. As soon as the sun started to rise, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The ground was covered in fresh tracks, barefoot prints, not animal, human. They circled my campsite, stopping at my tent before moving away into the woods. I packed my gear as fast as I could. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just wanted to get out. My heart pounded in my chest the entire hike back. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching me, following me, but I didn't. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief. I tossed my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. I sat there for a second, catching my breath, my hands still shaking. Then I noticed something. On the driver's side window, in the dirt and dust that had collected on the glass, was a single handprint. A bare handprint, bigger than mine. I hadn't seen it when I arrived. I hadn't left it there. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. I never camped alone again. I don't know why I went out there alone. Maybe it was the stress, the need to disconnect, or just the thought that I needed to prove to myself that I could handle it. I had camped before, plenty of times, but never alone. There was always someone around, a friend, a cousin, a group from work. This time, I wanted to be by myself. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. I picked a remote area, far from the usual campgrounds. A place where I wouldn't hear the distant sound of cars or see the glow of someone else's fire through the trees. I drove for hours, deep into the national forest, until I found a narrow dirt road that looked barely used. My truck bounced along the uneven path, the trees thick on either side, branches scraping the sides like fingers dragging across metal. When I finally reached a clearing, I killed the engine and sat for a moment, listening. The silence was heavy, almost too heavy. No birds, no wind, just the faint ringing in my ears from the long drive. I shook it off and got to work. I set up my tent near the tree line, built a small fire pit, and stacked my supplies carefully. I brought more than enough food, water, and firewood. I wasn't taking any chances. By the time the sun started setting, the fire was crackling, and I was settled in. The first night wasn't bad. It was cold, sure, and every little noise outside the tent made me freeze, but that was expected. I listened to the rustling leaves, the distant snap of a branch, the occasional hoot of an owl. Normal forest sounds, nothing alarming. I barely slept, though. Every time I drifted off, I'd jolt awake, convinced I heard something close. But when I'd peek out of the tent, there was nothing, just darkness and the dim glow of the dying fire. The second day was fine. I hiked a little, collected some more wood, and even found a small stream where I refilled my water bottle. But the feeling had started, that creeping sensation that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Being out there alone, so far from anything, does that to you. Your brain starts inventing threats, turning every shadow into something watching you. I tried to shake it, but it stuck to me like a bad smell. That night, it got worse. I was sitting by the fire, eating a can of chili, when I heard something. Not the usual creak of the woods, but something deliberate. A footstep. Not a deer, not some small animal. This was heavier. I turned my head so fast my neck popped, but I didn't see anything. Just darkness beyond the fire's glow. My hand went to the hatchet resting next to me, but I didn't grab it. Not yet. I listened. Nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. I forced myself to relax, finish eating, and clean up. I made sure all my food was sealed and stored properly away from the tent. Then I crawled inside, zipped up the entrance, and settled in. I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something moving outside the tent. Not an animal, not the wind, something moving, slow, deliberate, close. I held my breath. The fire was out by now, so the only light came from the moon, casting pale shapes through the fabric of the tent. I could see a shadow, a figure standing just outside. Not moving, just standing there. My body locked up. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, to make a noise, to grab the hatchet, but I couldn't move. I just lay there, my heart slamming against my ribs. Then, just as silently as it appeared, the shadow moved away. Slow, steady footsteps, fading into the trees. I stayed awake until the first hint of dawn. Then I forced myself out of the tent, gripping the hatchet so hard my knuckles ached. I searched the area, but there were no tracks, nothing to prove someone had been there. But I knew what I saw. I should have left. I should have packed up right then and there. But I didn't. I convinced myself it was a trick of the light, that I had imagined it in that half-asleep state. I told myself no one was out there. That night I was wrong. Started the same. A noise, footsteps, but this time they didn't stop. They circled my tent. Slow, methodical. I gripped the hatchet and forced myself to breathe as quietly as possible. Then, the worst sound I've ever heard. The zipper of my tent, moving. Not fast, not yanked open, just a slow, careful pull. I exploded out of my sleeping bag, screaming as I swung the hatchet blindly. The sound of something, scrambling away, the crash of footsteps vanishing into the woods. My fire was nothing but embers, barely lighting the clearing, but I saw the edge of movement, a figure just before it disappeared. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and whatever I could carry in one hand, and I ran to my truck. I didn't pack up my tent, didn't care about the rest of my gear. I just got in, locked the doors, and turned on the headlights. Nothing. I sat there, shaking, waiting for something to come rushing out of the woods. But nothing did. I don't remember the drive back, just that I didn't stop, didn't slow down until I saw the first signs of civilization. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, my hands aching from how tightly I had been holding on. I never went back for my gear. I don't know who or what was out there with me. I don't want to know. I always wanted to go on a solo camping trip. Just me and the woods. No distractions, no noise, just the sound of the trees swaying in the wind and the occasional rustling of wildlife. Sounded peaceful. Sounded perfect. So, I picked a weekend, packed my gear, and drove out to a remote section of the forest that wasn't as popular as the designated campgrounds. I wanted solitude. No people, no light pollution, no civilization. Just raw nature. The drive itself was long, nearly 4 hours on the highway, then another hour on a winding dirt road leading deep into the forest. The last 20 minutes of driving were rough. The road narrowed, flanked by thick trees on both sides, and I had to slow down to avoid hitting potholes and exposed roots. Finally, I reached a clearing, a small open patch surrounded by towering pines. It was perfect. The forest was dense, making it impossible to see more than a few feet into the trees, but I liked that. It gave the place a secluded feeling. I parked, got out, and took a deep breath. The air was crisp, fresh, and filled with the earthy scent of damp soil and pine needles. There were no sounds except for birds chirping and leaves rustling in the wind. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the trees for shade but far enough away to avoid any falling branches. I gathered some firewood, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. As the sun began to set, I sat back in my chair, sipping on a warm drink, watching the flames dance. It was everything I had hoped for. Quiet, peaceful, and completely isolated. But then, as the last light faded from the sky, something changed. First, it was small things. The woods grew too silent, the kind of silence that feels unnatural. The wind had died down, and even the insects had stopped chirping. I felt it before I noticed it, a strange heaviness in the air, like something unseen was pressing against me. I shook it off, probably just my mind playing tricks on me. I added more wood to the fire, watching the flames roar back to life, pushing back the darkness. But then I heard it, a sound from the trees, a single snap, a branch breaking. It wasn't an animal. I knew that much. Animals move through the undergrowth, making rustling sounds. This was deliberate. A single, sharp snap, like someone stepping on a twig. I turned, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, but I couldn't see anything. My flashlight was inside my tent. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to take my eyes off the trees. Then another sound, closer this time, a low, almost imperceptible shift in the foliage, like something was brushing against the leaves. I forced myself to stand, moving slowly, trying not to make a sound. I reached into my tent and grabbed the flashlight. My hands felt clumsy, stiff, but I managed to switch it on and aim the beam into the woods. Nothing, just trees, motionless and silent. I exhaled, maybe a deer or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat back down, closer to the fire this time, and kept the flashlight in my lap. I wasn't scared, I told myself, just being cautious. The night dragged on. Every so often, I would hear something. A faint rustling, a distant crack, but nothing ever revealed itself. Eventually, exhaustion got the better of me, and I crawled into my tent. I didn't sleep well. Every little noise jolted me awake. I felt exposed, vulnerable, like something was just outside, watching. When the sun finally rose, I was relieved. I stepped out of the tent, stretching, shaking off the stiffness. The woods looked different in the daylight, less menacing, more alive. I told myself I had let my imagination get the best of me. I spent the day exploring, hiking through the forest, gathering more firewood. By the time evening came, I felt more at ease. But then night fell again, and the feeling returned. The unnatural silence, the pressure in the air, the sense of being watched. I kept my flashlight close, my knife closer. The fire burned bright, but I couldn't relax. Every time I turned my head, I expected to see something lurking in the trees, just beyond the reach of the light. Then the sound. Not a twig breaking this time, not a rustling. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the trees. I froze, gripping my flashlight, my pulse hammering in my ears. I aimed the beam into the woods. Nothing. Then I saw it. Not a person, not an animal, but something that shouldn't have been there. A shape, barely visible in the darkness, crouched low to the ground. Watching me, I stood, my breath caught in my throat. The thing didn't move. It just stayed there, hunched and silent, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I didn't wait. I grabbed my knife, my keys, and backed toward my car, keeping my flashlight trained on the figure. My gear, my tent, I left it all behind. I jumped into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and turned the key. The engine roared to life. I looked up. The figure was gone. I didn't stick around. I threw the car into reverse, spun it around, and sped down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I don't know what I saw that night. Maybe it was just my imagination. Maybe it wasn't. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I always loved camping. There was something about being out in the woods, away from everything, that felt freeing. The silence, the fresh air, the way the stars looked when there weren't city lights drowning them out. It was all perfect. I had gone on solo trips before, but this time I picked a remote spot, deep in the forest, somewhere nobody would bother me. I had done my research. I scoured maps, read up on the area, and picked a location far from the usual camping grounds. It wasn't even an official campsite, just a clearing I found on an old hiking forum, a place only experienced campers went. It was about a 3-hour hike from the nearest road, and I liked the idea of being completely alone. No noisy campers, no litter, no distractions, just me and the wilderness. I set out early in the morning, my pack loaded with everything I needed. Tent, food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with extra batteries, a knife, a small hatchet, and a few other essentials. I followed the trail for the first couple of hours, then veered off onto a smaller path that led deeper into the woods. The trees grew denser, the air cooler. I could hear nothing but birds and the occasional rustling of leaves as small animals darted away. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to set. It was the perfect spot, flat ground, surrounded by tall trees, with a small stream nearby for water. I set up my tent quickly, gathered some wood for a fire, and got everything ready for the night. As darkness fell, I sat by the fire, eating a simple meal and enjoying the quiet. The only sounds were the crackling of the flames and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but as the night went on, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. It wasn't anything obvious, just a feeling, like I was being watched. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. I was alone, deep in the woods, and my brain was just adjusting to the isolation. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I stayed up longer than I planned, staring into the fire, listening. The sounds of the forest were normal. Crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls. Nothing out of the ordinary, but the feeling remained. I finally forced myself to get some sleep, crawling into my tent and zipping it up tight. I kept my knife close, just in case. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. It was dead silent. If you've ever been in the woods, you know how rare that is. The forest is always making noise. Wind through the trees, insects, distant animals. But now there was nothing, not even a breeze, just complete, unnatural silence. My skin prickled. I lay there, barely breathing, listening. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves. It wasn't far from my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, not an animal. Animals move erratically, scurrying or darting. This was different. It was careful, purposeful. I stayed completely still. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? No, bears wouldn't move like that. Another camper? No one else should be out here. A ranger? No reason for one to be this deep in the woods at night. The steps stopped just outside my tent. I held my breath. Then the sound of fabric shifting. Someone or something was touching my tent. I clenched my knife, every muscle tensed. The pressure of a hand against the fabric, moving slowly, like it was feeling for something, testing. I wanted to scream, to lash out, to do something, but I stayed frozen. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The hand withdrew. The silence stretched on. Minutes passed, maybe longer. My ears strained for any sound, but there was nothing. I don't know how long I lay there before exhaustion finally took over. When I woke up, the sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees. I sat up, my body stiff, my mind still foggy with fear. Slowly, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was the footprints. They were human, barefoot. Whoever or whatever it was had walked around my tent, pausing at the entrance. The prints were clear in the dirt, leading away into the woods. I followed them for a few feet before stopping. They didn't trail off. They just ended, like whoever made them had vanished. I packed up my camp in record time. I didn't bother eating. I didn't bother checking for more signs. I just wanted out. The hike back felt longer than before, every snap of a twig sending my heart into overdrive. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see something or someone following me, but I never did. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and sped off without looking back. I still don't know what happened that night. I tell myself it was just some weirdo messing with me, maybe a hermit living in the woods. But deep down, I know it was something else, something I can't explain. And I know one thing for sure, I'll never go camping alone again. I always loved the idea of camping. Something about being deep in the woods, away from everything, was peaceful. It was supposed to be an escape from the noise, from the constant hum of the city. Just me, the trees, and silence. That's what I thought, at least. I had planned this trip for weeks. I found a remote spot online, a place not many people knew about. It was deep in the Appalachian wilderness, miles away from the nearest town. There were no campgrounds, no paved trails, no cell service. Just nature. That's exactly what I wanted. I packed everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, flashlight, knife, extra batteries. I even brought a small hatchet for firewood. I was prepared, or so I thought. The drive took almost 6 hours. The last part was nothing but a dirt road, winding through thick woods. My tires kicked up dust, and the trees swallowed the sunlight. Felt like I was driving into another world. I finally reached the spot I had picked out, a small clearing near a slow-moving stream. It was perfect. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and took a moment to appreciate the silence. There was no traffic, no voices, just the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. I took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill my lungs. The first few hours were peaceful. I made a small fire, cooked some food, and sat back, listening to the sounds of the forest. The sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The air grew colder, and the sounds of birds were replaced by the distant calls of owls. Then I heard something. It was faint at first, a soft rustling in the brush. I assumed it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. I wasn't worried. But then it happened again, closer this time. I shone my flashlight toward the noise, but the light barely cut through the thick darkness. I couldn't see anything. The rustling stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Animals move at night. It was normal. I went back to my fire, trying to push the sound out of my mind. But then, just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just rustling. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the random movements of an animal. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the area. Again, nothing. My heart was pounding now. I stood there, listening. The footsteps had stopped. The woods were silent. I tried to shake it off. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just paranoia. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and laid down. Sleep didn't come easily. Every little sound made my eyes snap open. The wind through the trees, the creak of a branch, the distant hoot of an owl. I forced myself to close my eyes. Then, around 3 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first, but then I realized the woods were silent. Too silent. No wind, no insects, no night sounds. Just silence. I held my breath, listening. And then, right outside my tent, I heard breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Not an animal. Not a bear or a coyote. It was human. I stayed completely still. My mind was racing. Who was out here? I was miles from any town, deep in the woods. No one should be here. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The breathing continued, slow and steady, just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whoever, or whatever, was out there. Then the breathing stopped. I didn't move. I waited, listening. Minutes passed. Nothing. I slowly unzipped the tent just an inch, just enough to peek out. The fire had died down, casting faint embers. My flashlight was still outside, sitting on a rock. And then I saw them, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees, motionless, watching. My heart nearly stopped. They were too far away to make out any details, just a dark shape against the trees. But they were there, staring. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, slowly, they stepped back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. I waited for what felt like hours, knife in hand, eyes locked on the tree line. Nothing. Finally, as dawn started to break, I packed up my gear as fast as I could. I didn't care about breakfast. I didn't care about leaving a mess. I just wanted to get the hell out of there. I threw everything into my car and drove, not looking back. Even now, I don't know who or what I saw that night. I don't know why they were there or what they wanted. But I do know one thing. I'll never go camping alone again. I never liked camping, but my friend Jake convinced me to go. He had this whole plan, 3 days in a remote part of the forest, just us, a tent, and a few supplies. He called it disconnecting. But to me, it just sounded like an opportunity to be miserable in the cold, away from my bed. I agreed anyway. Maybe part of me wanted to prove I wasn't as much of a homebody as everyone thought. We drove for hours into the mountains, the road turning from pavement to gravel, then to dirt. By the time we reached the spot Jake had marked on his map, the sun was already dipping low. It was one of those places no one but experienced hikers or hunters would bother going to. Dense trees, no cell signal, and not a single sign of civilization. I didn't like it, but Jake was thrilled. He parked the truck, and we started unloading. The air was cold, and the forest was silent in a way that made me uneasy. No wind, no birds, just the occasional creak of branches shifting overhead. We set up camp by a small clearing near a narrow, slow-moving creek. The tent was large enough for both of us, but I already knew I wouldn't be sleeping well. That first night was uneventful. We built a fire, cooked some canned food, and sat in silence. Jake tried making small talk, but my nerves made it hard to focus. I kept looking around, scanning the trees. Felt like something was off, but I couldn't place it. At some point, we called it a night. I crawled into my sleeping bag and shut my eyes. Sleep didn't come easy. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig outside made my mind race. I told myself it was just animals, raccoons, maybe a deer. Still, it took hours before I finally drifted off. I woke up suddenly, unsure why. The fire had died down, leaving only a faint glow of embers. It was so dark I couldn't see past the tent walls. I listened. Nothing. Just silence. But then, faintly, I heard it. A soft crunch outside. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved around the tent, circling us. Not heavy enough to be a bear, but too controlled to be an animal. My mind raced. Jake was still sleeping, his slow breathing steady beside me. I wanted to wake him, but I was frozen. The steps stopped, right outside, inches from where I lay. Then nothing. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, every muscle tense, waiting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep without realizing it. The next morning, I told Jake. He laughed it off. "Probably a deer," he said, brushing it away like it was nothing. I wasn't so sure. The prints around our tent weren't hoof marks. They were footprints, barefoot, human. We should have left right then. Every instinct told me to pack up and go. But Jake insisted it was nothing. "Some hiker passing through," he said. "It's not a big deal." I tried to shake it off, but the feeling never left me. That afternoon, we went deeper into the woods, following a trail Jake had found on an old map. It was barely a trail, overgrown, uneven. As we walked, I kept feeling like we were being watched. Every time I turned around, there was nothing, just trees, just silence. At one point, we found something, an old campsite, but it wasn't abandoned in the normal way. The tent was still standing, zipped shut, but collapsed inward, like something heavy had been on top of it. A backpack lay beside the fire pit, half unzipped, its contents scattered. Clothes, a flashlight with dead batteries, a water bottle still half full. It looked recent, too recent. The fire pit was cold, but there was no mold on the food wrappers. Whoever had been here hadn't been gone long. Jake shrugged. Maybe they left in a hurry. But why? I asked. He didn't answer. We kept walking. The deeper we went, the worse I felt. Something was wrong with this place. The trees were too thick, the air too still. Eventually, I convinced Jake to turn back. By the time we got to our campsite, the sun was already setting. I was on edge. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my skin crawl, but nothing happened. No footsteps, no noises, just silence. The third day, we decided to pack up early. I was relieved. I wanted to get out of there. As we packed, Jake stopped suddenly, staring at the ground. "Did you do this?" he asked. I looked down. My stomach dropped. All around our tent, deep in the dirt, were handprints. Dozens of them, some small, some larger, pressed into the earth like whoever made them had been crawling. They led from the trees, circling our tent, then disappeared back into the woods. Neither of us spoke. We just finished packing as fast as we could. The drive back was quiet. Neither of us wanted to talk about what we saw, but I knew Jake was just as shaken as I was. We never went camping again, never spoke about it. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about those footsteps, those handprints, and I wonder if whatever was out there is still waiting. I never planned on writing this down, but some things feel heavier when left inside your head. Maybe if I put it into words, I can finally stop seeing those trees in my sleep. Maybe I can stop hearing the crunch of footsteps behind me when I'm alone. It started as a simple camping trip, one night in the woods just to clear my mind. I'd been feeling suffocated by the same routine every day, the same walls, the same dull hum of life grinding me down. So I packed a tent, some food, a flashlight, and a hunting knife just in case. The plan was to drive out to a remote part of the national forest, hike a few miles in, set up camp, and spend the night under the stars. The drive was uneventful, just me and the long stretches of empty road. The air smelled like damp earth when I stepped out of the car, the kind of fresh scent that made you feel far away from everything. I parked near a small gravel pull-off, grabbed my gear, and started down the trail. The hike in was peaceful. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting long golden streaks over the dirt path. It was quiet. The only sounds were my boots crunching over leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Felt good to be out there, alone with nothing but the woods. No cars, no voices, no distractions. I walked for about an hour before I found a clearing near a small stream. It was perfect. The ground was flat, the trees formed a natural barrier against the wind, and the water was close enough for convenience but far enough that it wouldn't keep me up all night. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood. By the time the sun started dipping below the treetops, I had a decent fire going. I ate a simple meal, just some jerky and nuts, while staring into the flames. The silence was comforting, wrapping around me like a blanket. As the night deepened, the woods came alive with sounds. The rustling of leaves, distant calls of animals, the occasional snap of a twig. I wasn't afraid, this was normal. I had been camping enough times to know the noises of the forest. But then there was something else, something that didn't belong. It was faint at first, a rhythmic sound, too distant to make out clearly. It came and went, weaving through the natural noises of the forest. I told myself it was probably just the wind, maybe a branch creaking under its own weight. I tried to ignore it, but as the hours passed, it became harder to dismiss. The sound wasn't random like the usual noises of the forest. It had a pattern, a deliberate, almost human rhythm. I stayed by the fire longer than I intended, not wanting to leave its warmth and light. Eventually, exhaustion won. I banked the fire, crawled into my tent, and zipped it shut. My knife was within arm's reach just in case. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of footsteps. Not an animal, not the wind. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just outside my tent. I lay there, heart pounding, listening as they circled my camp. I held my breath, ears straining for any hint of what it was. My fingers curled around the handle of my knife, gripping it so tight my knuckles ached. Then silence. It was worse than the footsteps. For long minutes I heard nothing. No rustling, no movement, just the deafening weight of silence pressing in from all sides. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then something touched my tent. A slow, dragging motion, like fingers tracing along the fabric. Every muscle in my body screamed at me to run, but I stayed frozen. Whoever or whatever was out there was trying to see if I would react. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still. The dragging stopped. Then the footsteps started again. This time they were moving away. I waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. My ears strained for any hint of movement. Eventually, when I was sure I couldn't hear anything, I reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on, flooding the tent with light. My hand shook as I unzipped the entrance just enough to peek outside. Nothing. The fire was just embers now, casting weak orange glows against the trees. The woods looked the same as before, but something felt different, like the air itself had thickened. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, waiting for the sun to rise. When it finally did, I stepped outside to check my surroundings. Everything seemed normal at first. My gear was untouched. No footprints in the dirt. No broken branches. Just the quiet hum of the forest waking up. But then I saw it. On a tree just a few feet from my tent were deep scratches. Long, deliberate marks carved into the bark. They weren't there the night before. Something had been out there, watching me, testing me. I packed up in record time, my gut telling me not to stay any longer. The whole hike back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing in the trees, just out of reach. But there was nothing, just the woods, stretching endlessly in every direction. I reached my car and threw my gear inside without a second thought. When I turned the key, the engine hesitated for a second before roaring to life. I pulled out onto the road, my hands gripping the wheel too tight. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there that night. I don't know if it was a person, some local who didn't want me in their woods, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing. I'll never camp alone again. I always thought I was the kind of person who could handle anything. I grew up hunting with my dad, fishing in remote lakes, spending days alone in the woods without a worry. But after what happened on that camping trip, I don't think I'll ever go out there alone again. It was late October, right at the tail end of the camping season. Most people had packed it up for the year, but I wanted one last trip before winter made the roads impassable. I drove out to a place I'd been before, deep in the forests of Montana, miles away from any town, far from where cell service reached. I liked the solitude. I liked the quiet. But looking back, I realized that maybe there's a reason people don't go out there alone. The spot I picked was near a river, a place I'd fished at a few times before. I parked my truck on the old dirt road, grabbed my gear, and hiked in about 3 miles. The air was crisp, the leaves dry beneath my boots. The trees were mostly bare, their skeletal branches reaching up at the dull gray sky. I liked the cold, kept the bugs away, made everything still. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, got a fire going, set out my cooking gear. The river was close enough that I could hear the steady rush of water and the occasional snap of a branch as some small animal darted through the underbrush. Nothing out of the ordinary. I made dinner, ate by the fire, and watched the sky go black. It was around midnight when I first noticed it. A sound just beyond the light of my fire. Not an animal, not the wind, a crunch, a deliberate step on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. Could have been a deer, but I knew what deer sounded like, and this was different. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it through the trees. Nothing, just shadows and trunks and leaves shifting in the breeze. I told myself it was nothing. That's what you do when you're out there alone. If you start jumping at every little sound, you'll drive yourself crazy. I put more wood on the fire, sat back, and let the heat wash over me. But that feeling didn't go away. That crawling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. Eventually, I went to bed, rifle close at hand. I wasn't scared, not yet, just cautious, but I didn't sleep well. Every little noise outside had me opening my eyes, gripping my gun. The wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, and once or twice that same deliberate crunch of footsteps. Morning came and I felt stupid, paranoid. I stepped out of my tent, stretched, let the cold morning air wake me up. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and tried to shake off that uneasy feeling from the night before. But then I saw them, footprints, not mine, fresh, pressed into the soft earth near my campsite. They came from the woods, stopped a few feet from my tent, then turned around and went back the way they came. I just stood there, staring at them, my brain trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe I made them last night and just didn't remember, but they weren't my boots. The tread was different, the size was different, and I would have noticed them before going to bed. I felt that same prickling sensation on my skin, that same crawling awareness that I wasn't alone. I turned and looked out into the trees, scanning for movement. Nothing. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I told myself to stay calm. People hike through here all the time. Maybe someone passed by, got curious about my campsite, and then left. It wasn't illegal to be here. It wasn't even that unusual. But still, they came right up to my tent. I forced myself to go about my day. I went down to the river, fished for a while, caught a couple of trout, enough for dinner. But even as I stood there with my line in the water, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd turn my head quickly, trying to catch whoever or whatever it was, but there was never anything there. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was already dipping low. I cleaned my fish, got the fire going again, cooked my dinner. I kept my rifle next to me, loaded, safety off, just in case. The night came fast. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cold air. I sat close to it, staring into the darkness beyond the trees, my ears straining for any sound. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Not footsteps exactly, but movement. The sound of someone, or something, shifting its weight, trying to stay quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just that deep black between the trunks, the endless forest stretching beyond my sight. Then I saw it, a shape just barely visible between the trees. Human but wrong, too still, standing there watching. My stomach dropped, my grip tightened around my rifle. I aimed the flashlight directly at it, but as soon as the light touched it, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire with my rifle in my lap, listening. The footsteps came and went, circling my camp, never coming too close. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know they were there. By dawn, I was done. I packed up fast, barely eating, barely thinking about anything except getting the hell out of there. My hands were shaking as I loaded my pack, doused the fire, grabbed my rifle. The hike back to my truck was the longest 3 miles of my life. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, feeling that presence just out of sight. The footprints followed me for the first mile, then disappeared. I made it back to my truck, threw my gear in the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there so fast I kicked up a cloud of dust behind me. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road, until I saw other cars, other people. Only then did I let out the breath I'd been holding. Only then did I let myself believe I was safe. I don't know who it was. A hermit, a hunter, some lunatic living out in the woods? I don't know, and I don't want to know. I never went back to that place. Never will. Some things you just don't mess with. And being alone in the woods, too far for anyone to hear you scream, that's one of them. I've always been a fan of solo camping. There's something about the silence, the isolation, the feeling of being completely disconnected from the world that appeals to me. I never thought much about the dangers that could come with it. I always figured that as long as I was careful, brought enough supplies, and stayed aware of my surroundings, I'd be fine. Last summer, I took a trip deep into a national forest I had never visited before. It wasn't an official campground, just a remote patch of land I had found through research. It was supposed to be untouched, free of people, free of noise, exactly what I was looking for. The drive took longer than expected. The dirt roads leading into the woods were rough, barely maintained, and lined with thick trees. My truck bounced over potholes, tires kicking up dust. I remember looking at the gas gauge and making a mental note to be mindful of how far I was from civilization. There was no cell service. I found a good spot near a small clearing. A river flowed nearby, and the tree cover provided enough shade to keep things cool. I spent the first few hours setting up my tent, gathering firewood, and making sure my gear was in order. I had my usual supplies: a hunting knife, bear spray, a flashlight, a small hatchet, and a .357 revolver. I never went camping without a firearm. You never know what you'll run into out there. The first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, listened to the sounds of the woods, and fell asleep without trouble. I woke up once in the middle of the night to the sound of twigs snapping, but I brushed it off as an animal and went back to sleep. The second day, I hiked around the area. I followed the river upstream, took some photos, and just enjoyed being alone. The woods were dense, but I had marked my path well enough to avoid getting lost. I didn't see any signs of people. No footprints, no trash, no old campsites. It felt like I was the only person who had ever been there. That night, things changed. I was sitting by the fire, finishing up a meal, when I heard something moving in the woods. It wasn't the usual rustling of a small animal. It was slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. The sound stopped. The fire crackled, filling the silence. I reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. Nothing, just darkness and branches swaying in the wind. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe an elk, but something about it felt off. I went to bed uneasy, keeping my revolver within arm's reach. At some point in the night, I woke up again. This time, I knew I wasn't imagining things. There were footsteps outside my tent. Slow, crunching steps. I held my breath, gripping the revolver. The steps stopped, then moved again, circling the tent. I was wide awake now, my heart pounding. I wanted to call out, but something in me told me to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped after a few minutes. I stayed awake for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. Nothing. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a light, restless sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was disturbed, footprints, not animal tracks, boot prints. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. There was no reason for anyone else to be out here. The nearest road was miles away, and I hadn't seen a single car or person since I arrived. Someone had been watching me, walking around my tent while I slept. I packed up quickly. I wasn't going to stick around to see who it was. As I loaded my gear into the truck, I kept scanning the trees, expecting to see someone standing there, watching. But there was nothing, just silence. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The truck rumbled to life, and I took one last look at the clearing before backing out. That's when I saw it. A small wooden carving, placed neatly on the log where I had been sitting the night before. A figure, human-like, but rough, crudely shaped. I didn't stop. I didn't think. I just drove. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing: I'll never go camping alone again. I went camping alone, which was a mistake. I know that now. I had done it before multiple times and nothing had ever happened. I always liked the solitude. Something about being out there. Just me and the trees, the wind, the dirt. It was peaceful. Until it wasn't. I had picked a spot deep in the national forest, far from any designated camping area. I wanted isolation. The place I chose was near a small, slow-moving river, surrounded by dense woods. There was no one around for miles. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and made myself comfortable as the sun started setting. Everything felt normal. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some food over the fire, read a book by flashlight, and eventually crawled into my sleeping bag. The only noises were the occasional rustling in the bushes, raccoons or some other harmless animal. I slept well. The second day, I decided to explore deeper into the woods. I marked trees with my knife as I went, making sure I could find my way back. The deeper I walked, the quieter it got. No birds, no insects, just silence. Felt wrong. I turned back after a couple of miles, constantly checking over my shoulder. That night, as I sat by my fire, I had the feeling I wasn't alone. I kept hearing sounds, branches snapping, something moving just beyond the firelight. I shined my flashlight into the darkness but saw nothing. I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I barely slept that night. Every little noise made me sit up, heart pounding. I held my knife in my hand, just in case. Nothing happened, but the feeling of being watched never left. The third day, I decided I had had enough. I started packing up my camp. As I was stuffing my sleeping bag into my pack, I noticed something strange. My knife was missing. I knew exactly where I had put it the night before, right next to me inside the tent. I tore through all my gear, looking for it. It was gone. Panic started creeping in. Someone had been in my camp. Someone had taken my knife. I needed to get out of there. I shouldered my pack and started hiking back to my car, following the GPS on my phone. I moved fast, trying to put as much distance between me and my campsite as possible. The feeling of being watched never went away. Every now and then, I swore I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, nothing was there. Then I saw it. A footprint. Not mine. Fresh. Deep. Someone had been following me. I started running. Branches whipped against my face. My breath came in short gasps. I wasn't thinking anymore, just moving. I didn't care if I lost the trail. I just needed to get away. Then I saw something up ahead. My heart dropped. It was my campsite. I had been running in circles. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I stood there, panting, looking at my extinguished fire, my scattered gear. I didn't understand how it had happened. I had been following the GPS. There was no way I had turned back, unless someone had led me there. I fought against the panic, trying to think. I couldn't stay. I had to get out. This time, I forced myself to slow down, to think clearly. I took out my phone again and carefully followed the GPS, double-checking my direction. As I walked, I kept glancing behind me. I knew someone was there. I couldn't see them, but I knew. My skin crawled with the certainty of it. After what felt like hours, I finally saw my car in the distance. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down. I sprinted the last stretch, threw my pack into the trunk, and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled away, something caught my eye in the rearview mirror. A figure, standing at the edge of the tree line, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back again. I drove straight home, my mind racing the entire way. I haven't been camping since. I don't think I ever will again.